G'day, welcome to season 5 of Lunch Money. We're coming into our 5th year of being the social media and online home for special situations, workouts and capital raising professionals. My name's Nick Samios. I am your Lunch Money host. And welcome to anyone who is watching us live, and welcome to our podcast listeners. I guess we've come out of COVID, and COVID's kind of old news to some extent now. And during COVID and before COVID, there were some new measures that were brought around to assist businesses to go through the restructuring process. Anyone that you speak to about corporate restructuring, whether or not we're talking about small businesses or larger businesses, when you see a business in distress and you wonder why. Often the case is you get to a business that's failed and you think, if only they'd taken action earlier. And you ask yourself, why don't businesses take the action earlier in order to assist a recovery instead of leading it too late? And I guess there's been a couple of reasons that you could say that people leave things too late. One is the stigma of going into insolvency, and the other one is the complexity. So particularly when it comes to small businesses, complexity has been a real issue. So during COVID, the federal government brought in a thing called small business restructuring, which was supposed to make the process of restructuring a small business to help it survive and recover from insolvency, to make it less complex. And for larger businesses, a few years ago now, in order to sort of deal with this issue of the stigma of taking action too soon, they brought in Safe Harbour. But look, I'm not the expert. I'm just a financier who gets these things across his desk. So we've got two experts to speak with today, and I'm going to introduce them. We've got Blair Pleash, who is a restructuring partner at Hall Chadwick, and we have Professor Jason Harris, who is a professor of law at Sydney University. So g'day, gents.
G'day, Nick.
G'day,
Nick. Now, listen, I'll start off with my sort of usual icebreaker question, and I'll start with you, Blair, since you've been with us before. What's been keeping you busy these last couple of weeks? What's crossed your desk that's interesting, that I guess gives our listeners a bit of a picture of what the day in the life of Blair Pleash?
Like I suppose a lot of professionals, the lead into Christmas does take a bit of momentum away, and you've got to get your, your practice up and running again, so people know who you are. But I suppose kind of noticed that, and it was leading into the end of last year, that there's a sort of an uptick in restructuring and insolvency work, which is probably down to the prevailing economic conditions. And certainly some specific industries, like I suppose, for instance, in the resources industry, there's been a few. There's been particularly in green energy sort of resources. There's been sort of price reductions in that space, commodity prices reductions, and that's obviously led to a few interesting sort of assignments. And it still looks like there's an element of the construction industry is continuing to have a bit of a difficult time of it.
Yeah, I've just thrown up a slide there of year-to-date insolvencies. I mean, construction's at the top of the pile there, and that's the one that makes the news, particularly in the home building sector, because it causes a lot of pain and grief. It's interesting you talk about the economy, because all the indicators are the economy's going great. Interest rates are coming down. There's a whole lot of signals. Property prices seem to be holding up, but of course retail sales were pretty rubbish. So you're seeing a bit of construction, you're seeing some of the green energy type stuff, and
yeah.
What about NDIS?
That probably hasn't. I guess that hasn't sort of reared its head on the radar yet. having said that, there's going to be service providers in that space, which at any stage of the cycle you'll find some of them being in a distressed condition.
What about, you haven't had any vape shops across your desk yet?
No, I have not had that. Interestingly enough, I was reading an article that the tattoo parlours the tattoos are going offline as well because of cost of living pressures. So I'm looking forward to a few of them as well.
Well, as the father of 3 kids who are all tattoo age, I'm very pleased to hear that. So very good. And Jason, you're I guess you're coming into a new year as far as students goes, but you are obviously also doing a lot of I guess research and one way or another into insolvency. What's sort of keeping you busy of late?
Yeah, so January is the period when generally we're doing research or going to conferences. Over the last few weeks, I've been spending my time getting right into the Indian insolvency and bankruptcy code, because I'm doing a bit of comparative research, looking at how India deals with insolvency, particularly insolvency disputes. They have a specialist court system over there that just deals with insolvency matters, and they've got some really interesting reforms on small business insolvency. So I've been reading all about that and writing some papers on that, and I'm about to give some presentations on that over the next few weeks. So yeah, that's been keeping me busy. But it's wonderful here on campus at the moment, because we're about to start O Week. So we've got all the tents and things going up, and the campus will be filled with about 60,000 students in about a week and a half. So it's a nice time of year on campus.
Fantastic. Yeah, my daughter's starting there this year. So
what's she studying?
She's studying ag science, but I think there's a little bit of echoes and stuff. I'm not sure if she's doing any law, but so okay. Look, I've seen a couple of deals lately where there's either SBRs being talked about or small business restructurings that have recently taken place. I had a deal cross my desk where a small business restructuring took place about a year ago, and apart from the fact that it was sort of the finance for that was poorly structured, hence it's on my desk now. It seems to have been otherwise successful, but a lot of our audience are commercial finance brokers. So whilst we have people from the insolvency profession that tune in, I guess it's people, commercial finance brokers sort of constitute a large section of our audience, and they're not legal professionals. They're not insolvency people that are dealing with these things day to day. So, and for us, sitting here, obviously small business restructuring's been around for a couple of years. But Blair, I mean, how do you explain what small business restructuring is to someone who might be a business advisor but isn't a legal expert?
Well, probably the best way of describing it is sort of VA light, because most people are familiar with what VAs are. It's
voluntary administrations. Yep.
Yeah, it's sort of VA light. It's intended for SMEs, and there's criteria where they have to. It's quite strict criteria. Like liabilities have to be less than $1 million. They have to have due and payable employee entitlements paid up, and they have to have their tax lodgements up to date. So that's gonna knock out a lot of distressed SMEs to begin with. And I suppose the intention is that it's supposed to carve a lot of costs associated with voluntary administration, so it's an accessible process for SMEs. And probably the centerpiece and the big distinction between that and or between SBRs and VAs is it's actually a debtor in possession model. The external practitioner, who's now called a small business restructuring professional, he doesn't actually take control of the business during the negotiation or restructuring phase sort of business, whereas he would in a VA. And that's sort of where the big distinction lies. It's for what they call a debtor in possession model.
Yeah, so obviously anyone familiar with corporate restructuring in the USA would know that the debtor in possession model is I guess, rather than the creditors or for that matter an administrator, an accountant being in charge of the business when it goes into administration, the directors are still in control. That's basically right. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. They
And
can't
so
sell a business or anything like that. They can only incur debts in the ordinary course of business, sort of thing.
okay, and as someone whose bread and butter obviously is doing this, do you think that, are you finding in the field that the fact that it's a lower cost process, and I guess sub question is it a lower cost process? It's a lower cost process, and the directors still retain control. Is that a big draw card for people taking action earlier?
Well, whether it's a draw card for them taking action earlier, it's probably a draw card for them to say compromise compromise ATO debt is probably one draw card of it, and the other draw card of it is it does seem to have, at least from the statistics that are available, it does seem to have. Because of the cost seems to be lower than VAs in practice. That seems to be translating in practice, and that's because some of these SMEs, they wouldn't really be candidates for a VA because it would be too expensive. But the SMEs do seem to be accessing this mechanism because it seems to the cost seems to be attractive, and that seems to that was one of the intentions behind the process. So to that extent, it's been a success.
Okay. And Jason, how would you sort of, in a nutshell, explain this process to a first year student? And what are you seeing in terms of in terms of the efficiency of small businesses taking this up? And is it saving companies from going out of business altogether? Is it actually meeting its mandate?
Yeah, I think it is meeting its mandate. And I was one of the early critics of this regime. I had great hopes for it. And when it was introduced in a pretty hurried fashion, we only had a couple of months to comment on the draft laws before they were introduced. I thought it was going to be a white elephant, and I wrote a paper explaining why I thought that. So I've been pleased that I've been proven wrong on that it is being taken up, and it's being increasingly used each quarter. We're seeing more and more appointments. Now, it's still well off where voluntary administration was when that was introduced back in 1993. So it's not as popular as other types of insolvency, but there's clearly a need in the smaller end of the market, the SME market, for this type of procedure. So I'd say, yes, it would be a success, but I think it could be still improved. We've had a parliamentary inquiry into corporate insolvency law last year, and there were various reforms recommended as part of that, one of which is this maximum $1 million liabilities ceiling, which we currently have. As to how I would explain it to a student, I always say to students in my insolvency course, focus on where's the problem in this business, or what are the problems in the business. And for many of these smaller businesses, the business people don't have the right information systems in place, so they get behind on some of their bills, particularly tax bills. Maybe they're not paying their taxes on time because that's basically providing the cash flow for the business. And so this is a regime which allows you to compromise your tax debt. Now, I do think there's a much broader question here in terms of policy. Should we have a procedure that basically requires you to go through this formal process, incur potentially tens of thousands of dollars in costs just to do a deal with the tax office? Why isn't there a more efficient, economical process to do a deal with the tax office? On the other side, we might say the tax office has got something like $36 billion in small business outstanding debt. Is it appropriate for the tax office to just be cutting deals, seemingly left, right, and centre on these things? Now, what we do know is the tax office is being very open and transparent, which is fantastic. They're going out and giving roadshows around the country, talking to insolvency practitioners, talking to accountants, explaining what things they look for to give approval. And they are certainly director loans. They want to see director loan accounts coming way down, and they want to see the tax compliance going up. So a better history of tax compliance, not just ignoring the tax office for years and then thinking you can do an SBR. But if you can tick those boxes and you can, offer maybe 25 cents in the dollar, I think the tax office is probably going to allow it to go through. That's a good outcome. It is being used. It does seem to be helping businesses. Anecdotally, I'm hearing that a lot of the directors in these cases are actually paying off their non-tax debts, and then they're just using this procedure purely for tax debts. And an ASIC study that we had released last year seemed to suggest that as well, in terms of very large proportions of the companies using this procedure. Tax is the only unsecured creditor. So that suggests they're dealing with the other other debts first.
Right. I mean, that raises a bunch of interesting questions. But I guess just to sort of keep it in the realm of the commercial finance broker without sort of getting into the weeds too much on the legal side of things. Yes, I mean, the ones I'm seeing, a lot of, and I don't see these, I guess Blair can speak to it better, but it does seem to be that the ATO is the primary target for these things. You mentioned $36 billion. Yeah, I've got written on my whiteboard here 30 billion. Some people say 60 billion. It's a bit hard to understand exactly what that number is. But it's a big number, whatever it is. And there's a lot of businesses that I've seen that have got 3 million, 4 million, 5 million who obviously don't qualify for SBR. And the other thing that I'm seeing is people seeking to refinance, for example, their superannuation liabilities. They're obviously scurrying around getting their reporting up to date, their lodgements up to date, and that sort of thing. Anything further to add to that, Blair?
Probably not a bit. No, Nick.
Yeah. Okay. So the other interesting thing that you raised there, Jason, is whether or not this is the most effective mechanism for the ATO simply biting down. I mean, it's interesting. I guess, there's a whole lot of challenges there for the ATO and how they go about those decision processes. But leaving that aside, you would say that okay. So now imagine that a lot of our audience are commercial finance brokers, and they get the phone call from their client. Listen, I need to raise some money against my house or against the business, my equipment or whatever it might be, and the broker says, well, what that's for? Well, I've got this $300,000 tax debt, or whatever it might be, and other creditors that are blowing out. Now, the commercial finance broker, their number one tool in the toolkit is refinance. But if the refinance is obviously beyond the scope of the available assets or the credit worthiness of the client, what are the things that the commercial finance broker should be asking his or herself before they sort of hand out Blair's phone number? I'll start with you, Jason.
Well, I think it's getting an assessment of how this money is actually going to help fix the problem. Has the business owner actually recognise what the problem is? So is this just a Band-Aid over a problem which is going to come up again in another 6 months or 12 months? Or have they actually accepted what the problem is and they need this to actually try and get over the hump? So, I mean, that's one of the big things with small business people, that, they're focused on the business of making widgets, not the business of widget making. So they don't have that appreciation of how to properly manage their costs, and they just need some good earlier advice to help address those problems at an early stage, so that, I mean, in a sense, sorry, Blair, but ideally they don't need to call Blair because they don't end up in an insolvency situation.
Yeah, I mean, I guess, the few cases that cross my desk too often is where the pre-insolvency advisor is sort of driving the whole process, and the whole process just seems to be obliterate the tax debt, without saying, well, why is the business in this situation in the first place? Is it making red widgets when the market's asking for blue widgets? Is it using manual labor to make the red widgets when maybe they should look at automating? Whatever the case may be. Now obviously there's some good pre-insolvency advisors who are using their networks to bring in other people to solve those problems. But yeah, in America they go Chapter 11 and they call it Chapter 22 when the thing goes in again.
Yeah.
Yeah. So any comments on that, Jason, before we ask?
Well,
Blair?
it's interesting you raised the phenomenon of repeat insolvencies in the US. Of course, you can't have that with an SBR or indeed a simplified liquidation. So once you've gone into the process, you can't use it again for another 7 years. And if you've got someone who's been a director of a company that's gone in, then any other companies that they're a director on also can't use it for a period of 7 years. So that deals with the repeat insolvency. But I'd also say I think the tax office is doing a good job, at least insofar as insolvency practitioners tell me about their discussions with the tax office, that if the substance of the restructuring plan through the SBR is a trade-on situation and a payment out of a percentage of trade-on revenues, then they want to see more detailed information. They want to see more realistic cash flow projections into the future. So I think that is a good step. So they're not just taking it blindly on the faith of whatever the director says is going to happen. But certainly with the pre-insolvency advisors, I mean, this has been an issue for many years. We've been lobbying the government, several governments now for many years, that there needs to be a bit more regulation in this space. The review of the Safe Harbour reforms that we had a couple of years ago also recommended that the government look at some further regulation about who can be a Safe Harbour advisor. So I think that is something that we should see more work being done by government on to provide greater clarity for business people. Now, one of the suggestions that's out there in the market, the Small Business Ombud made this in a review report back in 2020, was that maybe there should be, for example, a small business kind of advisory voucher that they can use to go off and get some advice to help them before they end up in financial dire straits. And that idea is something certainly that I would support.
So how would that work? A voucher, like a voucher to cover the costs? Are you saying?
Yeah. So it might be 5,000, 10,000, and they could go off and basically get a business health check. Before things get too bad.
Yeah, very interesting. Yeah, very, very, very interesting. We'll get to Safe Harbour in a minute, but what are your thoughts there, Blair? I mean, well, firstly, I'd just like to comment on Jason's comment about the ATO. Yes, I'm certainly seeing the ATO acting as bankers to some extent, because that's what they are. I mean, they've got a $36 billion bank loan book, is what it is. So yes, they are asking for forecasts and appraising these things as if they're lending money, which they effectively are. I tell people that the ATO are my biggest competitors, and people laugh. And I'm not joking. I mean, they are my biggest competitors. Yeah. What any thoughts to add, Blair, before we move on to Safe Harbour?
Well, I think the ATO is conscious of the situation that SBRs are going to have a limited number of creditors as a general rule, and that they're aware that they're predominantly going to be the majority creditor in the majority of cases. So I agree with you in that sense that they have at least formulated, it appears, a policy to deal with these things, because and they're in some senses they're actually asking for more than the law actually requires, because they want a copy of the restructuring proposal before it goes to creditors. They want a draft of it, right. And that, strictly speaking, the law doesn't. They're a creditor. The law doesn't say they're entitled to that. But strictly speaking, if they're the majority creditor commercially, you've got to get them on side. I guess there's politics versus Yeah, and like that can be probably contrasted with, particularly in the early days of VAs, it really wasn't clear what the policy of the ATO with respect to deeds was, aside from a blanket refusal. And on the rare occasion, you might see them approve a proposal which may not necessarily have had the greatest hopes of succeeding, but they'd approve it because of, as you say, the political. It may be a rural business or something like that, or a rural-related business. So that sort of did leak into some of the decision making. And let's face it, the ATO is a huge organisation. You're not going to necessarily see consistency. You don't even see necessarily consistency of who comes up on their radar. But
I mean, look,
the fact that they have the fact they've got a policy for dealing with these things is a positive sign. And the other, I guess, the thing about it is, that report that Jason alluded to, the dividends that have come, and admittedly that was a small sample size, the dividends that are coming out of these things, it's not necessarily sheep stations. We're talking about the majority of the dividends possibly are less than 30 cents in the dollar. But that kind of shows you what the other option, the result of the other option being liquidation would be. There'd be nothing. So
well, to be honest, in my experience, 30 cents in the dollar is a pretty good outcome for the ATO. So, there's that. And I would add that whilst it appears that the ATO is being very generous when it comes to SBRs, I've certainly seen them be very savage on VAs and basically bouncing lawyers out of court when they're trying to get a little bit too cheeky from the ATO's point of view. I do want to move on to Safe Harbour. So, Jason, let me give you my 1 minute understanding of Safe Harbour, and then if you tell me if I've got it right. And I'll give an example. Finance brokers work very closely with their clients, obviously, and you might have a business that's turning over, let's say, $30 million a year. So it's at the bigger end of small business, and it's big enough to have some non-executive directors. And the owner of the business goes to the finance broker, because of your expertise in raising capital, I'd really like you to join my board as a director. And the commercial finance broker looks at it and goes, this business is in a little bit of distress. Whilst I want to help this guy out, I'm not really getting a big, he might be offering me 20 grand a year to be on the board. It's not worth risking my house in the event this thing goes into insolvent trading. And so maybe we should put this thing into a safe harbour before I agree to add my expertise. Is that what it is? And are there other applications?
No, it's just designed to provide greater comfort for directors that if there are signs of financial distress, if they might suspect that the company could be insolvent, that as long as they are taking steps to get some good advice, to develop a plan that's going to result in a better outcome for the company, that they're not going to be exposed to insolvent trading liability, at least for that period. So one risk for the director, not for your finance broker who's just joining the board, but for the existing directors, is perhaps they leave it too late before they actually start taking the steps to try and engage the safe harbour. You've also got the ATO filing requirements that you've got to have your lodgements up to date, although not the tax payments. You've still got your employee entitlements that you have to have up to date as well. So the same, pretty same preconditions for the SBR, with the exception of that $1 million ceiling, which is only in the SBR.
So there are some boxes that need to be ticked,
Yep.
but the point, I guess, from a commercial finance broker's point of view, again, they might see a business that's in a little bit of distress, and they might say to the directors, "Listen, you may want, forget about it's, I'm not a director as the finance broker, but you may want to consider looking at safe harbour to protect your personal assets, so that you can actually try and save the business." Because one of the problems is that, as I understand it, was that directors, if they think the business is insolvent, strictly speaking, they should be putting it into voluntary administration. But if it's in a grey area, they can at least take the protection, so they're not going to get sued for insolvent trading. That's the way it works. Yeah. And I'll stay with you, Jason. When Safe Harbour first came out, I remember seeing marketing material. I can't remember if it was insolvency firms or might have been from legal practitioners, insolvency lawyers. And I remember getting this big double fold out chart, and it had, boxes and arrows, and it had sort of safe harbour on the left, and then there was arrows, and basically it was sort of seen as a step one before you go into administration. I mean, is that the intention, or is that just that's how it's supposed to work?
I'm not sure that that's the intention, but neither would I say that that's an abuse. I mean, as we know, many of these businesses have been in trouble for some time. So it's not as if everything's fine and then all of a sudden they're on the brink of insolvency. That can happen in some cases, I guess. So there's been issues for a while. And if you can use a safe harbour period just to try and work out what your options are and work out a plan, and maybe that plan involves going into voluntary administration because there's some benefit of doing that. You might be able to compromise a landlord, for example, or as we've been discussing, possibly compromise a tax debt, deal with the kind of the bad part of the business and save the good part of the business. I mean, in some cases, a safe harbour will lead to a liquidation. So I think the way it's being used, certainly by safe harbour advisors that I speak to and company directors that I speak to, it's being used in a way to try and provide a better outcome, whether that's using a VA, a liquidation, or ideally, the business is saved, it keeps on trading. No one except for the insiders is any the wiser.
Yeah. Okay, I'll come back to that. I just want to give Blair a chance to tell me what, as a practitioner, obviously you're, Hall Chadwick's a big national firm, so you must get a few of these things crossing your desk.
Yeah, you do. The reality of it is, it's probably for the big end of town. Large companies and large public companies, because they're the ones that are. It's not for every business. Directors of those companies, they don't just wander in and just sign up a VA or a SBA or an SBR. Well, they can't sign up an SBR, but it's clear the process gets used. It's just not. It's hard to quantify how much it gets used, but it's likely. Some of these large companies that you see going down and taking up the headlines in the business pages. They're no doubt been subject to some form of safe harbour advice in conjunction with an informal workout for a period of time. And it's obviously, and when I say it's the large companies, they're the ones who can afford it and afford the advisors, and they've got the horsepower to get through the other side in terms of resources, or potentially have the horsepower to get through the other side.
I guess part of the safe harbour process, of course, is being able to having a plan. I guess not, but obviously it's not a plan in the sense of the SBR plan. I guess interestingly, I suppose at the small end of town there's SBR, and at the big end of town there's safe harbour. I guess the middle market is still only really has voluntary administration. One of the things, Jason, that Blair said is we don't really know. There's no safe harbours aren't officially recorded anywhere, and that's obviously one of the advantages of them is that you don't have to tell the whole world what your problems are behind closed doors. I remember when they first came out, there was people saying, you should the ATO should know, whoever should know, but of course that's one of the whole points of this thing. I mean, is there any research done? Are you able to say that it is? You mentioned before you think or you intimated that it's successful. Do we know, do we have any stats at all?
So the only studies that I've seen on the Safe Harbour were conducted out of Melbourne Law School back in 2020. So that's 3 years after Safe Harbour came in. So Professor Ian Ramsey and Stacey Steele down in Melbourne did a study. They surveyed reader members and they got a couple of hundred responses. And what that showed was that the Safe Harbour work, at least in 2020, was not taking up a very large portion of those respondents' practices. So there was fairly low levels of engagement. They estimated that the respondents were saying less than 20% of their business was involved in Safe Harbour, and most practitioners at that stage had only done less than 5 Safe Harbours. Most of them had only done 1 or 2 Safe Harbours. So, I mean, their view was that, yes, it was serving a purpose. It was successful in that sense. I don't think we should judge Safe Harbour necessarily on the numbers of Safe Harbours or indeed on the numbers of companies using Safe Harbours that avoid some form of external administration, because you might need a formal external administration like a VA docker to actually deal with the problem that the business has, and then hopefully have a more successful, healthier company emerge from it. So no, there are no statistics. The government review, it was an independent review commissioned by Commonwealth Treasury back in 2021. They engaged a lot of stakeholders, a lot of insolvency firms, professional advisory firms, lawyers. I spoke to them, some other academics spoke to them, and they said, yes, it does appear to be successful. It does seem to be a useful tool in the toolbox, and certainly talking to practitioners during COVID and now after COVID, they tell me that they are doing a lot more Safe Harbour work. So yeah, I think we would say it's successful. Now, could it be improved? It could be improved. It could be a little bit more flexible. There could be a bit more certainty. ASIC, I think, would do well to issue a regulatory guide. I think that we could register small business advisors, the so-called Safe Harbour masters. That might deal with some of the untrustworthy advisors that ASIC and AFSA have been looking at. So I think we could improve it, but I think overall it is a success.
And I mean, Blair mentioned that he thought it was possibly an expensive process. I know that there's a lot of lawyers. Well, I've spoken to lawyers that seem to get a fair bit of Safe Harbour crossing their desk. So that raises the question: is a lot of this stuff lawyer-led rather than accountant-led? Although obviously a part of it, you're supposed to have a financial plan that shows how you get out of it. So Safe Harbour, it is there to protect the directors so that they can then try and save the business as opposed to take the personal risk. I remember when Safe Harbour first came out, people were saying, look, it's a bit, we really don't know how this thing's going to play out. We're going to need to wait until we see the court cases. Have there been court cases?
So there've only been 2 cases that have had any discussion about Safe Harbour. One was a very large matter, and the discussion of Safe Harbour wasn't so much whether the Safe Harbour was effective, but it was merely discussing the period of Safe Harbour before which a company went into voluntary administration. And that was I think it was a large mining company, and Freehills were the Safe Harbour advisors in that particular matter. And there's a lot of discussion about what sort of documentation you might have in place and the relationship between the directors and the company, very much a big end of town matter. The other case, which I've actually written an article on, was a case down in Victoria, which was a pandemic case, a small business running 2 cafes in Melbourne, affected by the shut lockdowns in Melbourne. And they tried to use a Safe Harbour to deal with the last basically 4 years of tax debts, which was never going to work. They hadn't made a tax return in 5 years, so they weren't eligible for Safe Harbour. Most of the debts were pre-Safe Harbour debts anyway. And also there was no plan. They had engaged an external advisor, but the external advisor was only engaged for the purposes of defending an ATO winding up application. And so there was no plan. In fact, this business had no records. They didn't have a computer.
Right. Okay. So it sounds like maybe a little bit of an abusive process there, but or an attempted abusive process. So that it has been. The courts have had a say on what boxes have to be ticked in respect of there being a Safe Harbour, but no one's, for example, tried to sue a director for insolvent trading, trying to challenge their protection, for argument's sake, in terms of Safe Harbour.
No, well, this one Victorian case, the liquidator was suing the director for insolvent trading, which was easily proved. The company had been insolvent for years. And the director, who I think was self-represented, then obviously had done some Googling and found out about this Safe Harbour and had raised the Safe Harbour, but it was so clearly not applicable, and the judge used it as an opportunity to say, here's all the reasons why you can't use a Safe Harbour.
Right. Okay, so Dr. Google didn't quite come up with
that's how they found their external advisor as well. Right. Well known in a particular state in Australia, will help you avoid your ATO debts.
Right. Okay. Well, that narrows it down to 2 or 3 people, but we won't go there. Okay. Now, yeah. So I guess we're sort of coming to the end of our time. So I'm just thinking again of the commercial finance broker that's sitting there with their client. They've got the financials in front of them. Now, if it's a small business, there's a couple of boxes that, things that they can look out for. Obviously, if the total debt's less than $1 million. But I guess the main thing is that they identify that potentially a small business restructuring is available to the small business, and they should really be picking up the phone to someone like Blair to maybe bounce ideas or to see if what the right professional advice might be. And then if it is a larger business where there's directors and potentially professional directors as well who aren't necessarily shareholders in the business, and they might want to discuss Safe Harbour. And both of these things seem to be successful at the moment. What would you change? What would you recommend changes in terms of Safe Harbour, Jason? What do you think could make it better and maybe more accessible?
I think providing more guidance. In some ways, the Safe Harbour could be considered a success because we haven't had any significant case law. It does seem to be working. People are using it. It's not getting challenged in court. So maybe that is a success. And we could say that more broadly about the Safe Harbour that operates in relation to general directors' duties, the duty of care and the business judgment rule. There's hardly any cases on the business judgment rule. So one way of looking at that is it's a tremendous success. People aren't getting sued if this could be raised as a defence. So in the absence of that guidance from the court, I think we should have more regulatory guidance. And this is something that in some areas, ASIC is very keen to get on the front foot and say, well, this is how we think fundraising should operate, and this is how we think conflicts of interest should operate. And they'll give you lots of guidance on those things, but come to directors' duties and Safe Harbour, and ASIC's approach seems to be, well, we're not lawyers, we're not here to tell you what the law is. Go and get your own legal advice. So I think if ASIC released a regulatory guide, which set out, here are the things that you should be looking for. Here are the things that make a good, appropriately qualified entity. If we had a register of those qualified advisors, I think that would go a long way, particularly with insurance and professional standards. So providing some further guidance, I think, would improve it.
Okay. All right. Well, look, by way of wrapping up, Blair, any sort of messages for commercial finance brokers coming into 2024? Obviously, whether or not it's 30 billion, 36 billion or $40 billion worth of tax debt, there's a lot of pressure there. What's your advice to a commercial finance broker that as they look at their clients, particularly the ones that are picking up the phone with working capital issues?
Well, I suppose the thing about it is it's human nature. Yeah. Insolvency practitioners love to tell people the earlier you take action about financial distress, the more options you have. But it's human nature. The reality of it is, calling an insolvency practitioner such as myself up is the last step on the road after all other options have been exhausted, like refinance, like attempting to sell components of the business or selling surplus assets, all those sorts of things. So I guess with that in mind, when a client approaches a finance broker with clear evidence of financial distress, it's probably an idea to at that point identify what options are actually available to the particular client, whether it be Safe Harbour, whether it be even SBR, but to actually identify a plan at that point, and then in terms of how you're going to get out, how the client's going to get out of distress, and then monitoring that plan. You give yourself, for instance, you give yourself 2 months to and make milestones sort of business in terms of, and the client needs to make milestones or in terms of how they're going to go about resurrecting their business, because not having a plan does lead to suboptimal results, and obviously having a plan and not implementing it and not monitoring it is going to end up with somebody knocking on the doorstep of a liquidator and ending up in a liquidator's in tray, and there won't be a good result for either the company or potentially the personal position of the directors. So I think that, and this is probably goes back to what you were saying before, it's not so much stigma, it's a bit about directors having an idea of losing control with these things.
Yeah, I guess that's a big fear. I guess, I mean, the more you let it go, the less resources are in the business, the less, the more suppliers have stopped supply, the more customers have received diminished quality of service or goods because of the lack of resources, and the fewer options are available to the business. Jason, any closing comments from yourself?
I certainly support everything Blair just said. There's a nice little quote in the explanatory memorandum that introduces Safe Harbour, which Treasury put together, and it said, "Hope is not a plan." So it's really making sure that the business person is actually coming to grips with what their fundamental problems are. And the reality is not every business should be saved. Not every business is economical. And so trying to make that assessment of, well, what is the problem and how are we going to fix it? What's the plan? Where do we need to get some advice? And maybe it is recommending that some of those clients go off and get a kind of business health checkup. And that includes things like making sure all your contracts are in place, making sure you understand the terms of your financial documents and your leases and your PPSR registrations and these types of things. Where you've got businesses that are using trust, making sure that people understand actually, how this business is supposed to operate legally, so that if they do continue to go into financial distress, then they have a better appreciation of what their options are. And I mean, that's good for the financier as well.
And as you say, I mean, for some people, it should be, listen, get out of business, save your house and get a job. Unfortunately, as you say, I think Peter Drucker, who
management guru.
There you go. Now Blair might feign being too young and not remembering Peter Drucker, but I think that he did make the comment that most turnarounds don't. So you do have to get in early to not be one of the stats. All right, gentlemen, thank you very, very much. Blair Pleash, partner at Hall Chadwick, and Professor Jason Harris from the University of Sydney. Very grateful to you both. Take it easy.
Thanks very much, Nick.
Cheers.
Thanks, Nick. Thanks, Blair.